Welcome back to Taking the Hill. This past week, I sat down with Senator Jack Reed, a member of the Armed Services Committee and a fellow Army 82nd Airborne paratrooper. He was one of the 23 senators who voted against the Iraq war invasion in 2002. Now, with the spread of ISIS and the brutal murder of an American, Congress is once again confronted with military action in Iraq. Senator, there was tragedy this week with James Foley, an American journalist who was beheaded by the radical Sunni terrorist organization ISIS. Your thoughts?
Well, this was a barbaric, gruesome act which illustrates not only the depravity of this group, but the fact that we have to deal with them with very preemptive means. Simply to try to deter them, reason with them is not going to work, but we have to be very selective. We have to make sure that when we're using our force, it's for our protection, American interests, both in the region and around the world. And also, we should be somewhat encouraged by the political changes in Baghdad. It doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect, but with the new leadership, there's an opportunity now to rally the Iraqi security forces, which are ultimately the answer to the crisis that ISIS is presenting to Iraq and also to a degree in Syria.
The terrorist who beheaded Mr. Foley, he spoke English and he had a British accent. And ISIS has threatened to strike here in America. Do those threats concern you? We have to be concerned. That's why we have to devote significant resources in terms of intelligence. And anytime we identify a potential threat to the United States which is credible, whether it's in Iraq or in Yemen or other places, we have to be prepared to take these terrorists out. The defense of our country and the defense of our interests are paramount, and the President has, over the last several years, made it abundantly clear that when we identify terrorist groups that are plotting against us and have reached a critical juncture or could reach a critical juncture, we will strike them before they can strike us. This past week, Iraqi and Kurdish forces took out ISIS fighters and recaptured the Mosul Dam. And of course, they got that help from U.S. airstrikes as well. Do you anticipate that type of U.S. involvement continuing in the near future? Well, I think our involvement has to be focused first on protecting our immediate interests. One of the reasons we were supportive of the Kurdish operation is because Erbil, the Kurdish capital, contains a significant number of Americans, and that town was essentially threatened by ISIS. And then in order to protect not just our presence in Erbil, but also to weaken ISIS so that it doesn't pose a threat to our diplomatic facilities in Baghdad, we continued other airstrikes. So there's two really dimensions of this issue. First, protecting American interests, and we will use military force to do that. And second, to encourage a political transformation in Baghdad, which will ultimately be the solution as we hope the Iraqi political leadership can galvanize their military forces to strike effectively against ISIS and destroy it. Are you hopeful, sir, with that political leadership, the new prime minister coming in now, are you hopeful that he'll reach out, unlike Maliki, but the new prime minister will reach out to the Sunnis and the Kurds and who have been so disengaged with the Shia government? I believe the Prime Minister will. Al-Abadi, the new Prime Minister, is someone both in terms of his background and his temperament much different than Maliki. He was educated and spent many years in Great Britain. He is someone that I do think recognizes that in order for Iraq to succeed, it has to have all of the groups, the Kurds, the Shia, the Sunnis, and other groups coming together in a united front against this barbaric terrorism of ISIS. So I think he will. It's not going to be an easy challenge, but I think we've got someone that has the capacity and I think has the intention, which is critical, to bring the country together and to work together. That is, ultimately, this is a political issue. Military aspects are sort of symptoms of the problem. The real problem is not having an inclusive government that people will stand with and stand for. Pew and Washington Post have polls that show approximately 54% of Americans support continued airstrikes, but not more ground troops. So there's now about 950 troops on the ground in Iraq, and the State Department this past week has requested another 300 troops to secure the embassy and the Baghdad airport. Are you worried about mission creep?
Well, you always have to be concerned about the scale of engagement. You know, we're putting American forces at risk. Our pilots are flying. We have troops on the ground. But again, we have to be very, very clear. These are forces that are defending our immediate interest. We have a significant diplomatic presence in Baghdad. We have a significant presence in Erbil. We have a responsibility to protect our diplomats, and that's the first order of business. And then again, we have encouraged and we've seen some progress on the political front. But when we're putting these troops, it does not represent a re-engagement in Iraq with large-scale American forces fighting conventional operations, essentially doing the task what the Iraqi military forces should be doing. I was one of about 20 senators who voted against the Iraq resolution back in 2002 because I did not think that was our job. But protecting our embassies, protecting our interests is something that we must do.
Sir, let me change focus here on the home front. You saw what happened this past week in Ferguson, Missouri, and some folks felt it looked like Iraq at times. The riots and the unrest, and really the paramilitary response from law enforcement. Will the Senate be looking, once you're back from recess, will the Senate be looking at the transfer of excess military equipment to law enforcement?
We will be looking at that. I think that's an issue that's been raised, obviously, by what's been going on in Ferguson. But there are several issues here. One is the proper police techniques to use against a group of Americans who are demonstrating. And the techniques in Ferguson, at least from my position, were not effective, and they were not the right techniques. But there are situations where some sophisticated equipment might be in order. But to lead essentially with a very sort of militarized approach to a crowd control issue is, I think, the wrong first step. But this issue and what we're providing to police, I think essentially one of the most important things we can provide is not so much military equipment, but more actual police officers, men and women on the street, and also the kind of training that makes these police very sensitive to how to deal with a situation, a very volatile situation like Ferguson.
So there's a report this week when it comes to veterans that showed that 1/4 of military families and veterans depend on food stamps or food banks. What more needs to be done to support our vets?
Well, we have to support our veterans. They've risked their lives, their families have served with them. One huge issue is, you know, we have to get this economy moving again. One of the reasons, particularly veterans, are finding a difficult time is because the job market is so difficult. And that's why, you know, although recently we were able to extend the Highway Trust Fund till next May, we should be thinking longer term. We should be thinking of infrastructure projects. We could be thinking of ways in which veterans can use their skills so they don't depend upon food banks. They can leave the service, find employment in a much more robust, growing economy. So one of the ways to address this issue is not just specifically with respect to the veterans, but getting the economy moving again. Infrastructure investment, looking at training programs to make sure that they're providing adequate training, lessening the debt of some of these veterans who have received training but they don't have a job and they have thousands of dollars of debt. All of that is something that we should be doing, and for the veterans, but also for working Americans across the board.
The Senate's going to be back in session in 2 weeks. Let's hope they can put their political parties aside and address these critical issues.